An Australian colonel stepped off a military transport in Saigon in the summer of 1962, looked around at the American advisory operation spread across South Vietnam, and within weeks wrote 5 words in his private diary that should have changed the entire course of the war. He has not grasped his task. He was talking about General Paul Harkins, the 4-star commander of every American military asset in the country, the man on the cover of Time magazine, the man who told President Kennedy the war would be won by Christmas, and the Australian who wrote those words, a colonel, not a general, not a senator, not a cabinet secretary, a colonel from Melbourne who commanded exactly 30 men, 30, in a country where the Americans already had thousands. And you know what happened when this colonel tried to warn Washington that everything they believed about the war was wrong? They smiled, shook his hand, took notes at his briefings, and ignored every single word he said. His name was Ted Serong, and the story of how one Australian officer diagnosed the fatal disease eating through the American war effort 3 full years before the Pentagon would even admit symptoms existed, is one of the most important and most deliberately buried chapters of the entire Vietnam War. Because Serong did not just say the war was going badly, he said exactly why. He identified the specific failures, the specific delusions, the specific institutional blind spots that would eventually consume over 58,000 American lives and accomplish nothing. He put it in writing. He said it to generals and intelligence chiefs and members of the National Security Council, and they let him talk because he was brilliant. Then they let him leave the room because he was Australian and a colonel. Stay with me. To understand how Ted Serong ended up in a position to see what American generals could not, you need to understand where he came from, not just geographically, but doctrinally. The education that made Serong dangerous did not begin in any military academy. It began in the Australian bush during the Great Depression. Francis Philip Serong was born on the 11th of November, 1915, in Abbotsford, a working-class suburb of Melbourne. His father, William, was of Portuguese heritage, a family that had originally come from the island of Madeira and settled in Australia in 1824. William Serong was a former soldier who had served in France during the First World War, and he raised his sons the way returned men of that era raised sons. He taught them to box. He taught them to shoot rabbits. He taught them to live off the land. And between 1930 and 1932, when the Depression stripped the family of everything resembling stability, the Serong boys spent extended periods living in the bush, surviving on what they could hunt and gather. That experience would matter more than any officer training course Ted Serong ever attended, because it taught him something fundamental about survival that most Western military officers never learn. The environment is not your enemy. The environment is your classroom. If you pay attention to what it teaches you, you live. If you impose your assumptions on it, you perish. Serong won a scholarship to St. Kevin's College, where the Christian brothers filled his head with ideas about duty, faith, and the global struggle between communism and Western civilization. That ideological framework would drive him for the rest of his life. He set his sights on the Royal Military College at Duntroon, failed to gain admission through the normal route, enlisted in the Citizens Military Force to qualify through an alternate examination, and graduated in 1937. His early career was unremarkable in the way that careers of future visionaries often are. Artillery, armored regiment, a switch to infantry, staff work with the 6th Division in New Guinea between 1942 and 1945, where he served under commanders who would later smooth his path to extraordinary assignments. He saw combat against the Japanese at Wewak in the final weeks of the war, earning a mention in dispatches. But what he absorbed in New Guinea was more important than what he achieved there. He watched the Japanese use jungle terrain the way a master chess player uses the board as an extension of strategy itself. He watched Australian soldiers adapt to conditions that defied European military conventions, and he began forming ideas about warfare that would take another 2 decades to fully crystallize. After the war, Serong's patron, Colonel Reg Pollard, who would rise to become Chief of the General Staff, recognized something in the younger officer, an originality of mind, a willingness to challenge orthodoxy, a capacity for thinking about warfare as an intellectual problem rather than simply an organizational one. Pollard steered Serong toward the assignment that would define his pre-Vietnam career. In 1955, Serong was given command of the Jungle Warfare Training Center at Canungra in southeast Queensland. What he built there over the next 2 years would become the foundation of Australian counterinsurgency doctrine for a generation. The courses at Canungra did not simply teach soldiers how to fight in jungle terrain. They reprogrammed how soldiers thought about jungle terrain. Under Serong's direction, the training emphasized automatic responses to contact situations, instinctive shooting, patrol discipline so rigorous that movement through dense vegetation became second nature rather than ordeal, physical conditioning that pushed men past the boundaries of what they believed themselves capable of enduring. But the conceptual breakthrough at Canungra was more important than any tactical drill. Serong taught his students that conventional soldiers think of the jungle as full of enemies lurking behind every tree. Effective jungle soldiers think of the jungle as home. The difference between those two mindsets is the difference between anxiety and mastery, and that difference, measured in operational outcomes, was the difference between survival and catastrophe. By 1957, Serong's reputation had grown large enough to attract international attention. The Burmese government, facing its own communist insurgency, selected him over candidates from Israel, the United States, and Yugoslavia to serve as counterinsurgency instructor to the Burmese armed forces. He spent 2 years in Burma as a military attaché and then as a strategic advisor, studying another jungle war, absorbing another set of lessons about how insurgencies functioned and what it took to defeat them. When the CIA station in Rangoon noticed the Australian colonel's work, they flagged his methods as potentially relevant to a deteriorating situation in Southeast Asia that was beginning to consume American attention, a place called South Vietnam. In early 1962, Secretary of State Dean Rusk acknowledged at an ANZUS meeting in Canberra that American forces knew little about jungle warfare. The Australian government agreed to send military advisors, and the man selected to lead them, hand-picked by the now Lieutenant General Sir Reginald Pollard, was Colonel Ted Serong. He was given authority to act with unusual independence. He personally selected his team of 30 officers and warrant officers, drawing from the best jungle warfare specialists the Australian Army could produce. Many had served in Malaya during the emergency. Several had experience from Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation. All had passed through Canungra. They were, by any reasonable assessment, among the most experienced counterinsurgency operators any Western nation could field. On the 3rd of August 1962, 29 of these men boarded a commercial flight from Singapore to Saigon. For diplomatic reasons, They had been instructed to wear civilian clothing for the journey. One by one, during the flight, they disappeared into the aircraft lavatory and emerged in jungle green, combat uniforms. By the time the plane touched down in Saigon, the first Australian soldiers formally committed to the Vietnam War were ready for what awaited them. What awaited them was worse than anyone had told them it would be. Serong did not wait for his team to settle in before conducting his own assessment. In May and June of 1962, even before the main body of the AATTV arrived, he conducted self-funded reconnaissance tours across South Vietnam. He traveled to outposts, spoke with Vietnamese officers, observed American advisory operations, studied the terrain, and began filling his diary with observations that read, decades later, like a clinical diagnosis of a patient everyone else was insisting was healthy. Under the heading General Situation, he recorded his findings with the precision of a surgeon noting symptoms. The situation was worse than he had been led to believe, and it was worsening. The Viet Cong plan was steadily developing. The government plan was developing on paper. In reality, nothing coherent was happening. Strategic policy was passive and reactionary. There was no unified control over the counterinsurgency effort, and then the entry that should have been carved into the wall of every command center in Vietnam, the assessment of the man running the entire American military operation. General Harkins has not grasped the nature of his task. Let us hope he does soon, for all our sakes. This was not idle criticism from a jealous subordinate. This was a professional judgment delivered by a man who had spent the previous 7 years doing nothing but studying counterinsurgency warfare, who had trained the armed forces of 2 nations in its prosecution, who had developed the doctrine that would produce the most effective jungle fighters of the Vietnam era. And he was saying, clearly and unambiguously, that the senior American military commander in Vietnam did not understand what kind of war he was fighting. General Paul Harkins was not a fool. He was a career officer who had served as George Patton's deputy chief of staff during the drive across Europe. He had been Maxwell Taylor's chief of staff in Korea. He was handsome, polished, and confident. Time magazine put him on its cover under the headline, "What It Takes to Win." He looked every inch the professional soldier. But looking the part and understanding the war were entirely different things. Harkins had been trained in conventional warfare. He thought in terms of front lines, flanking maneuvers, and decisive engagements. The press corps in Saigon would eventually nickname him General Blimp for his relentless optimism and his apparent disconnection from what was actually happening in the field. Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann, one of the most honest American officers in Vietnam, repeatedly tried to communicate the reality of the situation upward through the chain of command, only to have his reports filtered, softened, and contradicted by Harkins's staff. Serong saw all of this, and he understood exactly what it meant. The fundamental problem, as Serong diagnosed it, was not tactical, it was conceptual. The Americans were attempting to fight a counterinsurgency using the methods of conventional warfare. They measured progress in territory controlled, in enemy body counts, in missions flown, in ordnance expended. Serong understood that none of these metrics meant anything in a war where the enemy could choose when and where to fight, could melt into the civilian population at will, and could rebuild its forces faster than they could be destroyed. The only real indicator of progress in a counterinsurgency, Serong argued, was the volume of intelligence spontaneously offered by the population, not intelligence extracted through interrogation, not intelligence gathered by electronic surveillance. Intelligence volunteered freely by ordinary people who believed the government could actually protect them, because that willingness to inform was the only reliable measure of whether the population trusted the side you were fighting for. And in 1962, the population of South Vietnam did not trust the government of Ngo Dinh Diem. They did not trust the American advisors propping him up, and they had no reason to. The strategic Hamlet program was supposed to change that equation. Modeled loosely on the successful resettlement strategy the British had used during the Malayan emergency, the program aimed to relocate rural Vietnamese into fortified villages where they could be protected from Viet Cong infiltration and gradually won over to the government side. In theory, it was exactly the kind of population-centric counterinsurgency approach that experts like Serong advocated. In practice, it was a catastrophe. Serong recognized the problem immediately. The program was overextended. It was expanding too fast, creating hamlets faster than they could be properly defended, supplied, or administered. Each new hamlet that was established without adequate security became not a fortress against the Viet Cong, but an advertisement for their capability. When insurgents penetrated a strategic hamlet, and they penetrated many, the message to the surrounding population was devastating. The government cannot protect you, even inside its own fortifications. Why would you trust them outside them? Serong tried to communicate this assessment. In May of 1963, he accepted an invitation to lecture at the Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He intended to use the platform to make his case directly to the American Special Operations community and, through contacts in Washington, to the National Security Council itself. At Fort Bragg, his training methods were received with genuine interest. The Americans recognized the tactical value of Australian jungle warfare techniques and adopted several of them into their own counterinsurgency courses. But when Serong raised the strategic question, when he argued that the strategic Hamlet program was expanding without consolidation, that territory was being lost along the borders, that Viet Cong numbers were actually increasing despite official reports of progress, he ran into what he would later describe as the problem of the junior ally. His tactical advice was welcome. His strategic warnings were not, because Serong was a colonel from a nation providing 30 advisors to a war that America was managing with thousands. No one expected a colonel to shape strategy. No one expected Australia to tell America how to run a war. His rank and his nationality made him easy to listen to and easier to dismiss. At a counterinsurgency group meeting in Washington on the 23rd of May, 1963, Serong expressed his doubts about the strategic Hamlet program's trajectory directly. The response was a violent challenge from Marine General Victor Brute Krulak, one of the most aggressive personalities in the American military establishment. Krulak was not interested in hearing an Australian colonel question a program that Washington had invested enormous political capital in defending. Serong returned to Vietnam. His warnings about the strategic Hamlet program went unheeded. Within 6 months, President Diem was dead, overthrown in a coup that the Kennedy administration had tacitly supported. The new military government that replaced him conducted an honest assessment of the Hamlet program and discovered that the reality bore almost no resemblance to the reports Harkins and his staff had been sending to Washington. Of the 8,600 hamlets that had been reported as complete, only 20% met even minimum standards of security and readiness. The program had been a Potemkin village on a national scale, and Serong had been saying so for over a year. By February of 1963, Serong's private assessments of General Harkins had grown sharper. He recorded that at a briefing that evening, Harkins had given the appearance of having lost his grasp of the strategic direction of the war and was settling for the daily trivia of operations without any coherent framework connecting them to larger objectives. This was the diagnosis of a commander who was managing a bureaucracy rather than fighting a war, moving pieces on a board without understanding the game. The tragedy was not simply that Serong was right. The tragedy was that being right did not matter. The institutional machinery of the American war effort was not designed to process warnings from junior allies. It was designed to process information that confirmed existing assumptions. Optimistic reports from Harkins and his staff flowed smoothly up the chain of command to Washington, where they were received by officials who needed to hear good news. Dissenting assessments, whether from Serong or from American officers like Vann, encountered friction at every level. When Serong monitored CIA weekly intelligence summaries to see how much of his own analysis was making it into the assessments, reaching senior decision-makers, he found the answer was not nearly enough. His reports were read, filed, and largely forgotten. The journalist David Halberstam, who was in Vietnam during this period and would later write extensively about the disconnect between official optimism and battlefield reality, confirmed that Serong's analyses were among the most accurate available. But accuracy was not the criterion by which information was valued in the American command structure. Convenience was. Harkins was eventually replaced in June of 1964 by General William Westmoreland. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had grown disillusioned with Harkins' optimistic reports, had no desire to consult with the departing commander. Harkins retired to obscurity, taking up painting in Dallas. The problems Serong had identified did not retire with him. They metastasized. Under Westmoreland, the American commitment escalated from roughly 16,000 advisors to over 500,000 combat troops. The strategy of attrition that Westmoreland adopted, seeking to destroy enemy forces through overwhelming firepower and large unit operations, was precisely the approach Serong had argued would fail. It treated the Vietnamese insurgency as a conventional military problem requiring a conventional military solution. It measured progress in body counts and kill ratios rather than in population security and political legitimacy. Serong, meanwhile, continued his own war. After handing over command of the AATTV to Colonel David Jackson in 1965, Serong remained in Vietnam, seconded to the United States State Department under arrangements that placed him effectively under the CIA. He became the senior advisor to South Vietnam's police field force, developing a paramilitary security capability designed to protect the rural population at the village level. This was the kind of ground-level, population-centric counterinsurgency work that Serong had always advocated. Small teams embedded in communities, intelligence gathered through relationships rather than raids, security provided consistently rather than episodically. He established a training center at Tri-Mat in the Central Highlands, modeled on the Conungra approach, patient, methodical instruction in the skills that actually mattered in this kind of war: patrolling, ambush, counter-ambush, community engagement, the reading of terrain and population alike for signs of insurgent activity. The graduates of this center would go on to provide some of the most effective local security operations of the war, but Serong remained frustrated by the macro-level American approach. He had access to senior Americans. He briefed the National Security Council, he consulted with the Pentagon, he was received, even celebrated, by officials who recognized his expertise. But the institutional momentum of the American war machine was beyond any individual advisor's ability to redirect, especially an advisor who wore the uniform of a nation, providing a fraction of a percent of the total Allied force. Ambassador Maxwell Taylor, when informed that an Australian AATTV member named Captain Barry Peterson had achieved extraordinary success organizing Montagnard tribesmen in the Central Highlands into an effective anti-communist self-defense force, asked a question that revealed everything about the American attitude toward Allied contributions. Why is an American not doing this work? The implication was clear. Success by a junior ally was an embarrassment, not an inspiration. Robert Comer, the American official who ran the Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Program, eventually stopped returning Serong's communications entirely. When Comer needed troops trained in colonial policing methods, he considered asking the British to find him Bhutanese soldiers rather than draw on Australian expertise that was already in-country, already proven, already available. The institutional preference for American solutions to American problems, even when those solutions were demonstrably inferior, was absolute. Serong left the Australian Army formally in 1968 with the rank of brigadier, but he did not leave Vietnam. He stayed on as a security and intelligence advisor, preparing strategic analyses for the Rand Corporation and the Hudson Institute, consulting for the Pentagon, and for 3 successive American administrations. He remained in Vietnam for the entirety of the American involvement and beyond, staying until the very end. When the North Vietnamese Army converged on Saigon in April of 1975, Ted Serong was still there. He escaped in the final helicopter evacuation from the American Embassy on the 29th of April 1975, the day before the city fell. He had been in Vietnam in one capacity or another for 13 years, longer than any other Australian, longer than most Americans. He had watched the entire arc of the war from beginning to end, from the early advisory period, when 30 Australian specialists might have helped shape a counterinsurgency strategy that actually worked, through the massive American escalation that drowned whatever remained of strategic coherence under a flood of firepower and bureaucracy, through the withdrawal and abandonment and final collapse. And through all of it, the fundamental warning he had issued in 1962 remained valid. The Americans had not grasped the nature of their task. The men Serong had selected and trained, the members of the AATTV, wrote their own chapter of the war, while their commander fought his lonely strategic battle. The team, as they were known, became the most decorated Australian unit to serve in Vietnam. Over 10 years and 4 months of continuous deployment, the longest operational commitment of any Australian unit in any war, 1,009 men served with the AATTV. They earned 4 Victoria Crosses, more than any other Australian formation in the conflict. They received 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 6 Military Crosses, 20 Distinguished Conduct Medals, and a staggering 245 American and 369 South Vietnamese decorations. These were not statistics accumulated by men operating in comfortable headquarters. AATTV members worked individually or in pairs, embedded with Vietnamese units across the entire country, from the Mekong Delta to the demilitarized zone. They served with ARVN regular forces, with regional forces, with special forces teams among the Montagnard Hill tribes, and with units conducting operations that remained classified for decades. 33 members of the team were killed in action. 122 were wounded. These casualties, measured against the unit's small size, represented a rate of sacrifice that exceeded most formations in the war. The men of the AATTV fought, advised, and died in the manner their commander had envisioned, as professionals embedded in the war at its most intimate and dangerous level, trying to make counterinsurgency work from the ground up. But the tactical excellence of the AATTV could not compensate for the strategic failures Serong had identified. The war was not lost in the jungle. It was lost in the briefing rooms and conference tables where men with stars on their shoulders refused to accept that their assumptions were wrong. When the first Australian task force deployed to Puak Tui Province in 1966, they brought with them the operational philosophy Serong had helped develop: small unit patrolling, patient intelligence gathering, population security as the primary metric of success, integration with local communities rather than isolation in massive fire bases. The results validated everything Serong had been arguing. Enemy activity in Puak Tui Province declined dramatically. Viet Cong forces increasingly avoided Australian-controlled areas. Captured documents revealed that Communist commanders issued explicit instructions to avoid contact with Australian troops wherever possible, using language that conveyed something beyond ordinary military caution, something closer to dread. The enemy called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The term carried supernatural weight in Vietnamese culture, suggesting forces that could not be seen, could not be predicted, could not be fought through conventional means. It was the highest compliment an adversary could pay, and it applied to Australian forces alone among all Allied contingents in Vietnam. American generals observing Australian operations could not reconcile what they saw with what they believed. General Westmoreland visited the Australian task force in January of 1967 and described their approach as very inactive. The Australian commander, Brigadier Stuart Graham, responded through official channels with barely contained fury, pointing out that his force had achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1 while sustaining the lowest casualty rates of any comparable Allied formation. The enemy was avoiding contact not because the Australians were passive, but because the Australians were so effective that engagement had become irrational from the Viet Cong perspective. But this was precisely the kind of success that American metrics could not measure. Westmoreland wanted body counts. The Australians measured success in declining incident rates. Westmoreland wanted aggressive large unit operations. The Australians conducted patient, persistent, small unit patrols that gave the enemy no rest. Westmoreland wanted visible action. The Australians produced invisible results. The doctrinal gap between what Serong had been teaching since Canungra and what American generals practiced in Vietnam was ultimately unbridgeable during the war itself. The institutions were too large, the assumptions too deeply embedded, the political stakes too high for any amount of evidence to force fundamental change. The lessons were available. The Australians shared them freely. Individual Americans recognized their value. The evidence was overwhelming and accessible to anyone willing to examine it. But institutions do not change because evidence demands change. They change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. And in Vietnam, that cost was distributed across thousands of individual casualties rather than concentrated in a single catastrophic event that might have forced immediate reform. Ted Serong returned to Australia after the fall of Saigon and found, like many Vietnam veterans, that civilian life did not accommodate the person the war had made him. He had spent 13 years at the center of one of the most consequential conflicts of the 20th century. He had advised generals, intelligence chiefs, and presidents. He had developed doctrine that would eventually be recognized as decades ahead of its time. And he came home to suburban Melbourne, where none of that mattered. His later years were complicated. He involved himself in conservative political causes and citizens' militia groups. He spoke publicly on defense issues with the same intensity and conviction he had brought to his military career. Some of his positions were controversial. Some were difficult to defend. The man who had seen Vietnam more clearly than any other Australian observer in 1962 did not always see Australia with the same clarity decades later, but his legacy in military doctrine endured long after his politics faded from relevance. When the United States military finally began serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, the reforms incorporated principles Serong and the Australians had demonstrated effective decades earlier: small unit operations, patient intelligence gathering, cultural adaptation, population-centric counterinsurgency. The same principles that had been dismissed, classified, and buried during Vietnam became standard practice at Fort Bragg and Coronado. When American forces found themselves fighting insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, they relearned, painfully and expensively, lessons that had been available since 1962. The Counterinsurgency Manual, published under General David Petraeus in 2006, contained principles that Ted Serong could have written 4 decades earlier: population security as the foundation of strategy, intelligence gathered through relationships, patience over firepower, the recognition that you cannot kill your way to victory in a war among the people. One of the most decorated American officers of the Vietnam era noted in his post-war writings that techniques he had observed Australians using successfully in 1969 did not become standard American practice until the 1990s and beyond. The delay in adopting these lessons, measured in years, was also measured in lives. Ted Serong died in Melbourne on the 1st of October 2002, at the age of 86. General Sir Francis Hassett, one of Australia's most respected soldiers, described him as a quiet, deep thinker, brilliant tactician, very brave in the field, and a good leader. Those qualities had taken him from the working-class suburbs of Melbourne to the corridors of power in Washington and Saigon. They had made him one of the world's foremost authorities on counterinsurgency warfare. They had earned him the Distinguished Service Order and decorations from 3 nations, but they had not been enough to change the course of a war. In 1962, an Australian colonel wrote in his diary that the American general commanding the war in Vietnam had not grasped the nature of his task. He was right, and the fact that he was right, and the fact that being right did not matter, tells you everything you need to understand about why the Vietnam War ended the way it did. The diagnosis was accurate. The patient refused treatment, and by the time the fever broke, it had already consumed everything. Ted Serong saw it first. He said it clearly. He put it in writing. He told the generals. He briefed the National Security Council. He stood in rooms full of the most powerful military officials on earth and explained with the quiet precision of a man who had spent his entire career studying exactly this kind of problem, what was going wrong and why. and they listened politely, and they took notes, and they went right back to doing exactly what they had been doing before he walked in, because he was Australian, and he was a colonel. And the most powerful military in the history of the world was not going to take strategic direction from a man who commanded 30 soldiers from a country most Americans could not find on a map. That decision, the decision to dismiss the warnings of the one man in the room who actually understood counterinsurgency warfare, was not made once. It was made every day, in every briefing room, across every level of command, for over a decade. It was made by generals who measured success in metrics that measured nothing, by politicians who needed good news more than they needed truth, by institutions that preferred comfortable failure to uncomfortable learning. The Australians proved there was another way. Serong showed them where the other way led. The Americans chose not to follow, and 58,000 names ended up on a black granite wall in Washington because the people who needed to listen to a quiet, deep-thinking colonel from Melbourne were not willing to hear what he had to say. He has not grasped his task. 5 words written in a diary in 1962. 5 words that predicted everything that followed. 5 words that no one with the power to act on them was willing to believe. That is Ted Serong's legacy. Not the decorations, not the doctrine, not the decades of service. The legacy is the warning that was right, the warning that was ignored, the warning that 50 years later still echoes through every briefing room where powerful men convince themselves that the war they are fighting is the war they wish it were, rather than the war it actually is.